So, yeah, we got a little bit.
Still a little bit of time.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
So I think, now I'm going to
Mr. President, we had an issue that came up on our break. If we have any other matters, please don't wait and let me know if we need to adjust anything else. Ma'am, I'll remind you, I'm sorry, Doctor, I'll remind you, you're still under the oath, Mr. Carter.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Starsky.
Thank you. I'm going to move forward to another topic, and that's the question of adolescent immaturity and adolescent brain development. You testified in going over your credentials, your familiarity with adolescent development.
I think there have been major contributions to the research recently. I think the MacArthur study on culpability was a major study that helped us identify which areas adolescents were less mature than adults and in which areas they reached adult levels during adolescence.
Are some of the immaturities in some juveniles reflected in the crimes they commit?
Oh, yes.
And can you describe generally what you mean by that?
Well, what the MacArthur study showed is that adolescents are impulsive. Impulsivity goes down with age. They are sensation-seeking. They are not oriented towards the future, and they're far more influenced by peers than adults are. So there are many adolescent crimes, from drugs to alcohol to drunk driving to speeding, show evidence of adolescent immaturity. These are things they wouldn't do as adults typically. The adolescents commit far more crimes than they do as adults. Most adolescent crimes begin and end in adolescence. And that's because the brain does mature and they commit fewer of the crimes that have those characteristics.
The impulsivity, the attraction to short-term pleasures, that sort of thing?
Impulsivity, sensation-seeking, lack of awareness of consequences, and the influence of peers.
So I understand that peer influence has a great impact on the kind of offenses typically committed by adolescents. Is that it?
Yes. What did it show? That the adolescent wasn't thinking. So they'll put, for example, things on the web, not understanding that anything on the web is public and permanent. So if most adolescents show traits, their crimes are informed by this developmental immaturity. But some adolescents commit crimes that are caused by deeper individual pathology and not by developmental immaturity. That's the decision we have to make in deciding whether a kid can be managed on an outpatient basis, for example.
Did you consider whether this offense showed the characteristics of developmental immaturity, whether that was an influence or mitigator in this case?
I did.
And what did you conclude?
This crime doesn't show any of the characteristics of developmental immaturity. It was not impulsive. It was not either done with peers. It was not something peers would have approved of. The kind of sensation-seeking that adolescents go after are things like drinking or drugs or driving fast or having sex, something like that. This is not the kind of sensation-seeking that is typical of adolescents. And there was considerable care given to the avoiding detection, so there was a future orientation.
And you talk in your report about two classes that are generally described of adolescent offenders. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, most adolescents are transient offenders. They are not likely to continue to offend as adults. Their crimes are informed by adolescent immaturity. They begin and end with adolescence. That's the reality for the vast majority of adolescent crimes. They're also what we call chronic life persistent offenders, and that's a minority, but they actually commit most of the crimes. And that minority usually has offenses prior to adolescence, offenses during adolescence, and then they continue after adolescence, and they're often psychopathic youth. Those are not the only groups, but they're the two major groups.
And you talked about a third group that isn't often studied.
Well, the third group has to do with crimes that have nothing to do with adolescent immaturity, and these can be things like a murder, a sexual murder, sadism. Most adolescents do not commit this type of crime.
Are you familiar with any crime in the United States like this one, involving the abduction, murder, and dismemberment of a 10-year-old girl by a juvenile?
I'm not. I am not. I have had 3 other murder cases this year of adolescents, and this type is extremely rare.
Can this offense in any way be described as a result of adolescent brain, or excuse me, immaturity, or immature adolescent brain development?
No, in my opinion, this is indicative of individual pathological processes. It is not a crime that is a typical adolescent crime. It isn't even typical of the chronic psychopathic adolescent offenders. This crime has to do with deeper and more compulsive individual pathology.
What about the ability to plan, or the planned nature of an event? Is it fair to say that adolescent crimes tend to be less planned?
Yes, they're more impulsive.
Did you see evidence of planning in this case?
Considerable evidence.
Can you give us a few of the highlights of the planning?
Okay. He took a forensic class. He said he was learning to kill people and get away with it. He picked a time when elementary school children were on their way to school. He had ties handy to bind her hands. He tried to throw off police by leaving the backpack in one place and a torso in another. When the police interviewed them, he told them about a suspicious person and a suspicious car. These are all examples of planning. He also researched chloroform on the internet. He decided, when he was unsuccessful with the adult jogger, that he needed someone with a smaller body type, and decided to go after a child. He said that he would have done the same thing to the jogger that he did to Jessica, indicating that he had the plan to murder and dismember prior even to the attack on the jogger. So there's no sense in which you can say this was an impulsive offense.
The attack on the jogger at Kettner Lake occurred May 28th of 2012. And I think that's what you were referring to. You're aware that he said that he made chloroform for the purposes of that attack.
Yes, he said he researched how to make chloroform on the web, and he made chloroform for the purposes of that attack.
And you're also aware that he shoved a cross into Jessica's vagina. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Is that the kind of behavior, in conjunction with others, typical of adolescent crime?
No.
His ability to change his plan in the Kettner attack after she fought him off, is that characteristic of adolescent crime?
No. He learned from his mistakes, what he would have considered mistakes, and then he formulated a new plan.
He put her backpack some miles away from the scene, with putting some items in the pack, some out. He put in the pack her glasses, some of her clothing that smelled of urine, a water bottle with the words "Life is Good" on it. And it also had her name. Is that significant?
Well, it's certainly significant in the fact that he had thought through how he might throw off the police and throw off suspicion.
And leaving a water bottle with her name on it, would that suggest he wanted the police or others to find that evidence?
Yes. Well, he said he did, that he left it there to throw them off, so that presumes he wanted it to be found. He left it in a very public place.
Shoving a cross into her vagina and leaving that in the torso, was that consistent with his claim that he wanted to make the body disappear?
No, I don't know how shoving a cross in her vagina helped make her body disappear.
He said that he etched 3 designs on the cross that he put in her vagina. Would that help dispose of the body?
No, that has, whatever his motives for that were, it doesn't have anything to do with body disposal.
In your experience, why would he shove a cross in her vagina? Why would he first put 3 etchings on the cross and shove it into her vagina?
Objection, Your Honor. Because of disclosure, speculative, lack of foundation.
Well, I'm not sure what you're asking. My recollection was that was covered in the interview, so he made maybe some reference to that in the interview. I mean, she may or may not know that. If you want to ask her to speculate, I'll sustain the objection. If she has a basis that's in the evidence, that's fine.
Have you interviewed other offenders who engage in behaviors to shock others?
Yes.
Is that a characteristic of certain types of offenders?
Well, narcissism is a characteristic of many sadistic offenders.
Have you interviewed offenders who like to place memorabilia of their or mementos of their crime in public because of the attention they get from it?
Objection, Your Honor. This is a significant stage of the proceeding.
I'll sustain the objection.
Let me move on to another topic. We received last Friday, late in the afternoon, a report from a Dr. Waters. Did you have a chance to review that report over the weekend?
Yes, sir.
In essence, what is he saying? What do you understand him to say in his report?
Objection, Your Honor. Dr. Waters' report can speak for itself.
Well, maybe it can, maybe it can't. I don't understand it. I thought maybe the doctor did.
That's fine. I don't know if I do or not. Has that been submitted to you? I have a report? Then you don't need to ask what it says if I have.
Well, Your Honor, as a trained psychologist and someone who's authored many, many evaluations, I thought she could talk about some of the opinions there and what they mean, and I'm not sure what they mean.
Is this your expert?
This is an expert. Now let me finish. What he did neurological, psychological testing on Mr. Sigg. Ms. Salter is not a neurologist. She does not do neuropsychological testing. So she doesn't have the qualifications, as far as I've seen or as far as been laid out in her CV, to opine on Dr. Waters' opinion.
I can lay some more foundation if that helps.
You may, but I'm not inclined to let her discuss the opinions of someone of a different discipline than she does.
Do you rely on neuropsychological testing in your field
Yes.
frequently?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the different neuropsych or the different testing that Dr. Waters did in this case?
Well, what's important is not all of his testing was neuropsychological. He also did the MMPI and made statements about executive function and so forth.
And the Rorschach. Is that right?
And the Rorschach, which is not a neurological test. So I wouldn't comment on the neurological test because I'm not a neurologist, but that was only a part of his report.
All right. With that in mind, if I understood this correctly, did Dr. Waters suggest that there may be some deficits in Austin Sigg's executive functioning?
Yes.
Do you agree with that opinion?
No.
And first of all, could you tell from the report what the basis of his conclusion was?
That's a very difficult report to read, not because of the neurological terms, but because he more or less contradicted himself in different places. It's really hard to know what he meant. He said he's not psychotic, then he later said he had some psychotic processes. He did tests that apparently did not generally show any major deficits, and then said, well, he thought he had some problems in executive functioning. He thought he might be dissociative for the episode, but he clearly has complete memory for the episode. Honestly, it was a very difficult report to make sense of.
I'm glad I wasn't the only one.
I'm sorry.
Nothing. It was a comment, not a question.
Let's stick to questions.
Thank you, Judge. Fair enough. The Rorschach was administered apparently by Dr. Waters, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Is that a helpful instrument? Well, what conclusion did he draw from the Rorschach, if you could recall?
I can't recall specifically.
Did it make sense in your over 40 years as a psychologist to draw the conclusions he drew from the Rorschach?
She didn't remember what...
30 years.
30 years?
So, if she didn't remember what conclusion she drew, have to change it.
I'm not sure.
Next question, please.
Do you remember, do you have Dr. Waters' report in front of you?
No, sir.
Well, I'm going to get back to that. I'm not sure that you've answered this, but he says that he saw deficits in executive functioning, basically Mr. Sigg's ability to, if I understand it correctly, to plan based on his evaluation of Mr. Sigg. First, did you see evidence of that in the data in the report generated by Dr. Waters, other than his conclusion?
Yeah, I don't know where that is coming from, because I didn't see evidence in the report for it, and also executive functioning has to do with the ability to manage and regulate and organize, to plan, to strategize, to pay attention to detail, and in fact, that seems to be a strength of Mr. Sigg's, at least in terms of real-life functioning and how he committed this crime. So I don't see any evidence that Mr. Sigg has a deficit in executive functioning.
Is it fair to say that a psychological test is often a prediction of behavior, but that you can actually look at the exhibited behaviors to see whether the prediction makes sense?
You should never go by a psychological test alone. You have to look at a psychological test and the behaviors of the person, and they should match.
All right. Based on your evaluation of Austin Sigg and considering thank you, you're right. Based on your evaluation of this crime and Austin Sigg's characteristics, do you see any support to Dr. Waters' conclusion that his executive function was impaired?
Your objection.
I'll sustain the objection. She's already testified.
All right.
You're reacting the same way.
He also said at some point that he had some sort, or might have had, I couldn't follow it, some form of dissociative disorder. Do you remember that part of the report?
Yes, sir.
What is a dissociative disorder?
Well, typically it refers to an altered state of consciousness in which you do not remember later when you come back to your normal state. You do not remember what happened. People who are highly dissociative may find clothes in their closet that they bought and they don't know where they don't remember getting them. Now that's the usual definition. You can use it to define a split between emotions and cognition as well. So when, for example, a victim may be testifying about what happened to them, and in order to keep their emotions distant, they just numb and shut down and try to make it just a narrative story. So it was unclear in the report if he was saying to me that he believed that he really was in a dissociative state and did not remember what he did. That would certainly be contradicted by everything he has said. Or is he using it in some other sense to mean that he was dissociated affectively from what he did? It wasn't clear.
He does talk, if I recall, Dr. Waters, he does talk about Mr. Sigg saying that he had no emotional memory during the event, or shutting down emotionally. Am I understanding Dr. Waters?
Well, as far as I understand him, he did try to say that there...
Objection, Your Honor. If there's confusion, then the report should be relied on. I don't think that this is proper.
Your Honor, if I may, a report was submitted...
But I think she said that she hadn't seen the report or didn't remember the report, and then you're asking her to opine as to what he said.
Going to testify, and
I'll make the determination as to
all right.
weight and credibility of each of the witnesses. That's my judgment.
Okay. Let me back it up this way. Did you see any evidence of dissociative disorder in Austin Sigg as manifested, in this crime?
No, he remembers everything he did. It's clear he was not dissociative in the ordinary sense of the term. In the sense of being emotionally dissociative, another way to look at that is being callous, meaning he didn't have the feelings most of us would have in that situation, but there's no evidence that was due to dissociation, that by his own account he had spent a lot of time looking at similar crimes in pornography, and he was callous.
So, if I understand you, because someone doesn't feel normal emotions when they're doing what he did to Jessica Ridgeway, that doesn't mean that he was dissociating.
No, it certainly doesn't. It can mean that he was just callous and felt no guilt, and in fact may have had positive emotions while he was doing it.
Your Honor, move to strike.
It's beyond the question, so I'll strike the last part.
You've used the Rorschach in you're familiar with research on the Rorschach?
I am. When I was a teaching fellow at Harvard, actually it was my responsibility to teach the Rorschach sections.
In your professional view, did Dr. Waters use the Rorschach and interpret it correctly?
Well, the Rorschach is an ink blot test. And you look at ink blots and you describe what you see. In recent years, it has been far more standardized than previously, and the scoring has become more objective. But I still do not use it and almost never see it in court because I do not believe it has the kind of reliability and validity that is needed for court cases.
He says, you refer to the MMPI, and that Dr. Waters says that, if I've read this correctly, that he has a mild elevation of the disconstraint score. What is that?
Well,
Again, I'm going to object. The witness has testified that she did not understand the report, and she is only familiar with a certain amount of testing. Testing was both neurological as well as psychological, and it is those two things combined that form the basis of Dr. Waters' opinion, which is in the report, which is self-evident for the court. I'm going to ask that this line of questioning.
The MMPI is...
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. She may testify as to what the definition of what was it?
Well, disconstraint, lack of constraint. But can I answer?
This comes from the Rorschach, I assume?
No, this
he's
is
not
the
talking.
MMPI, which
Now
is
he's
not a
talking about the
neurological
MMPI.
test.
Yes, sir.
Which is not
so
a...
you're asking her to define what that means?
Yes.
You may do something.
Well, the part that was hard to define was mild elevation because he didn't give any of the real data from the report. The MMPI, you send it off, it comes back with a description of the person, according to the MMPI, but that wasn't in there. All he said was that he had a mild elevation. Well, does that mean in relation to his other scores, but they were all within the norm? Or does that mean that was actually in the pathological level? He did not explain that in his report. That's why I didn't understand what he meant.
And what is disconstraint? I'm not sure that's defined in
It's a subscale that has to do with, lack of constraint over activities.
So impulse control?
Yes?
All right.
As far as I remember, yes.
And you answered previously whether you saw any evidence of issue
I've
in
answered
that.
that, yes, sir.
And all right.
She did testify later, but you're correct.
Good. To cut to the chase, did Dr. Wada's report offer anything that aided your understanding of Mr. Sigg's crime or his thought processes?
No.
Objection, Your Honor.
She said her understanding, so that's
You also looked, in your report you referenced that you looked at Austin Sigg's background.
Yes,
Is that
sir.
right? How he was raised, his school issues, drug use, all those things. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Did you find that they contributed to this, our understanding of this crime and what may have caused it in any way?
No. It appears that Austin Sigg, by his own account and the account of other people, that he was never abused physically, sexually, or emotionally. His parents were separated, or divorced rather, but that happens to millions and millions and millions of kids in this country. It appears that both parents loved him and were somewhat lenient as parents with him, but he does not have an abusive background.
You're aware that his mother found him watching pornography when he was younger, child pornography, and got him into treatment because of that.
Yes, I thought that was very significant.
And significant why?
Because he knew that what his mother did in 2008 was she didn't turn him into the police. Child pornography is a crime. She tried to help him. She got him treatment. So what he knew was that if he had told her that it was getting worse or that it was becoming more brutal or more horrific, he could rely on help from his mother. And he also knew that treatment was available. And he did not tell her. He did not seek treatment when both parental support and treatment were available.
And you're aware that of his statements and his mother's statements that he smoked marijuana.
Yes.
Did that contribute to this offense in any way?
No, sir. Marijuana is not correlated with sexual murder.
I want to talk a little bit, or not talk, ask questions, you'll do the talking, about the role of pornography here. I think it's fair that everyone would like, in a case like this, to have some insight into what causes someone to behave this way. First of all, let me ask this. Do you think it's harmless for adolescents to view violent pornography?
No, I am not a fan or supporter of violent pornography in any way. I do not think it is good for anyone to watch it.
And Mr. Sigg, Austin Sigg, as you testified, he said that he viewed violent pornography, including depictions of people being killed, people being dismembered in a sexual fashion. Does that cause someone to behave in the way he behaved?
People seek out the pornography that interests them. It is not that pornography comes and grabs you and makes you watch it. If people are attracted, find themselves aroused to pornography that they know is inappropriate, the reaction of many people is to stay away from it. It is to be very upset and to stay away from it. The problem is that he made choices all along the way to watch this pornography and masturbate to it, knowing, it obviously was right in front of him, the nature of this pornography, that he was being aroused by violence, by murder, by mutilation, of children, and so forth.
But if an otherwise normal person sees more and more violent pornography, can't that cause them to act in those ways?
No, sir.
She hasn't been qualified as an addiction expert or specialist.
objection? Are you trying to ask her if that was the cause or a causation?
A causation.
of misconduct?
Yes.
Are you qualified to opine as to why he did what he did, Doctor?
I'm qualified to talk about the impact of child pornography. I train on child pornography.
You have, which you have. You've done that.
Yes, sir.
The impact. But are you saying that's the cause? But for him doing pornography, this would not have happened?
No, I'm not saying that.
The objection sustained. She testified as to his reaction to pornography. If you're asking her the ultimate question, well, that's why he did this, that objection sustained. Next question.
How do normal people react to exposure to violent pornography?
Well, there was a survey done by Dr. Bork, who is the chief psychologist for the U.S. Marshals. And in that survey, he sought out individuals who had to see pornography because they were part of the police or part of an ICAC task force, and received over 600 surveys in response. And what he found is that 46% had trouble sleeping, 39% felt discouraged about the future, 46% were emotionally numb. There's a whole list of things that happen to people, and they're all negative. In other words, far from getting more aroused by the porn, it burned them out. It affected their life in other ways. They became more depressed, they felt less hope for the future. And that is, so what I'm saying is that is the more typical of the impact. It's not good for anybody, but for most people, it actually has a very detrimental impact on their emotional well-being.
In your clinical experience, in your experience evaluating violent sexual offenders, I'll strike that. Does his exposure to violent pornography, his seeking out violent pornography, in any way mitigate the risk that he presents? In other words, take out the violent pornography, does that make him safer?
Objection, Your Honor, lack of foundation.
I'll sustain the objection. Those are the facts. If you would do a hypothetical as to but for him ever seeing pornography, would he have done this? I don't think that's appropriate.
No, and I didn't.
That's an inappropriate hypothetical.
Right, and I didn't mean to ask it that way.
Next question.
Well, do you know, based on your 30 years of studying the issue, what causes somebody to be sexually aroused by torture, by dismemberment, by those sorts of things?
No, sir.
What was your answer?
No.
And because of that, do we know how to fix it?
No.
You say in your report that what Mr. Sigg did, that the abduction, murder, dismemberment of a 10-year-old child can only be described as malevolence. What did you mean by that?
Objection, Your Honor. It's not relevant.
You're asking her to define the malevolence?
As it relates to this case.
I'll rephrase. What did you mean by that?
The intention to inflict harm.
We've discussed earlier your experience evaluating sex offenders in various circumstances, including in prisons. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with typical Department of Corrections treatment protocols for sex offenders?
Yes, sir.
In your expert opinion, is Austin Sigg treatable?
Objection, Your Honor. Objection for a few reasons. Lack of foundation. At a minimum. The knowledge of correctional institutions as a whole across the United States is not particularly helpful for this court's consideration. Possibly, and I'm not conceding this, but possibly knowledge of the Colorado Department of Corrections and the treatment provided through the Colorado Department of Corrections may create some small relevancy, but then we would still need additional foundation. I'm objecting to the form of the question as well as the
objection sustained, that's a determination to be made by the Department of Institutions, Department of Corrections.
Can I?
As to whether he is or is not treatable, or is amenable to treatment, and sustain the objection.
Are you aware of any studies on people like Austin Sigg that suggest he's treatable?
Judge, same objection.
I'm asking for the professional studies in the field.
I think she's already testified about the classifications. I'll allow the question. Understand that you said that's this third or that unique category, I think, that you
Yes, sir.
placed this conduct in, or this mindset.
Yes, sir.
All right, you may respond. Over your, understood.
I'm not aware of any outcome studies, recidivism or outcome studies of sadists or sexual murderers. It's a very rare phenomenon, so the only way to get a big enough sample would be to go to different institutions around the country, because each of them has so few. And the problem is that typically they aren't let out. So you would have to let them out and then see if they reoffended. And typically people who are caught for crimes like this, adults, are not let out of prison. So I'm not aware of any study that tells us whether the likelihood of reoffense.
And I'm not sure that you've answered this in pieces, but what kind of sexual offender, what kind of offender is Austin Sigg?
Well, he's certainly sadistic, and you can tell that by his pornography and his behavior. He is likely, he's a necrophiliac in the sense for sure that he dismembered her, and he has admitted sexual arousal to dismemberment. Whether or not he also had sex with the viscera, I am not able to say, but I would say for sure that he is sadistic and he is necrophiliac in the sense of his enjoyment of dismemberment.
I think she's testified to all of this previously, and so you're going back over manager's evidence.
That was my last question.
Thank you.
I think it is. Your Honor, if I could have just a moment.
All right. If you need a break at any time, please let me know.
Thank you, sir.
Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Sandra, do you have questions for the doctor?
Thank you,
Please. And if you need a break at any time, I know we've had a break, please let me know, Ms. Manning.
You currently work as a psychologist for the corrections program in Wisconsin.
I consult to them half-time.
Okay. You're currently not on any faculty with any university or college.
That's correct.
You're not a medical doctor.
No, sir, no, ma'am.
You're not a psychiatrist.
No,
You can't prescribe medication.
no,
You're not a licensed psychologist in Colorado.
not in Colorado. I am in Wisconsin.
Now, in terms of your underlying education, your Bachelor's of Arts came in philosophy and English,
Yes, it did.
not in biology,
No,
not in chemistry,
no,
not in psychology.
no.
Your master's came in child study,
Yes,
not child development, but child study.
well, that was child development at Tufts.
Your master's was not in clinical psychology,
No,
was not in experimental psychology,
no.
and was not in biology or chemistry or neurobiology.
I think I've testified that it was in child study.
You're not a neuroscientist.
No,
You're not a member of the International Society for Neuroscience.
Well, that would be difficult.
She's not a neuroscientist. She wasn't qualified as one. I can ask her questions about that.
She said she was not.
And she's also testified, Your Honor, regarding components of adolescent brain development, and so I am inquiring into lack of qualification regarding both the information she gave on Dr. Waters' evaluation, as well as the information she gave under oath today to this court on adolescent brain development.
You may cross-examine.
Thank you. You're not published in any academic journals in the field of adolescent brain development?
No.
Okay. Never qualified as an expert in that field?
Now that I don't know. I've been qualified as an expert on child and adolescent development. I don't think it was separated out by brain development.
Okay. Well, you're not a member of the International Neuropsychology Society,
Well, I'm not a neuropsychologist.
and yet some court did allow you to testify as an expert as a neuroscientist?
No, I've never said that. I said I've been qualified to testify on child and adolescent development.
Okay. And was that specific to brain development?
It includes yes, it includes cognitive development as well.
You are not certified in Colorado to treat sex offenders?
No, I'm not located in Colorado.
You've never worked for the Colorado Correctional Facilities treating sexual offenders?
No.
I'm sorry, I thought her objection, Ms. Fenway's objection, the reason I wasn't allowed to get into the treatability of Mr. Sigg in prison was because of her unfamiliarity, at least, with the DOC treatment protocols here.
I understand you're going through everything that she's not. She's told us what she is and what her qualifications are. I assume that anything that you haven't told us that you were qualified, then you're not qualified.
Yes, sir.
Let's go for you.
Thank you, Your Honor. You are also not qualified in Colorado to treat juvenile sex offenders. This is my last question on the topic, Your Honor.
All right. If that's your last question, you may answer that.
That's correct. I don't work in Colorado.
Okay. Now, moving on to treatment standards for juveniles in Colorado. In Colorado, juveniles are treated differently than adults in terms of therapy for sexual offenders.
Two things. First, it's not relevant. Mr. Sigg is an adult. He is not a juvenile. Secondly, we've already established that gentleman.
He was not an adult.
Cross-examination, if it's too far afield, I'll try to direct us back. I think the question was, they're treated differently in Colorado, adults and juveniles.
Yes.
And are you aware that under Colorado law, generally the principle of the no cure for juvenile offenders is rejected?
And again, it's not relevant. He is not a juvenile offender. He's an adult.
He was a juvenile at the time of the offense, Your Honor,
Thank you.
and it goes to our qualification.
Thank you. She's presented that to you as a statement of practice in Colorado. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
Next question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, today in court, you're testifying under oath, rendering a professional opinion without ever meeting Austin Sigg.
Pardon?
Today in court, you're rendering
Oh,
opinion.
today in court?
Yeah.
Yes, I've never met Austin Sigg.
Okay. Never personally spoken with Austin Sigg.
That's what I said.
Never performed any testing on Austin Sigg.
I believe that's covered by not having met him.
No psychological testing and no neuropsychological testing.
That's correct.
You indicated that you did a careful review of materials.
Yes.
Now, you did not seek out and personally interview Austin Sigg's mother
No, I did not.
or father
No.
or treatment provider
No.
or any family member, friend, classmate, former teacher.
No.
You conducted no personal interviews
No,
in
I
your
based my
evaluation.
testimony on the records that I reviewed.
And let's talk about the record. The record was supplied to you by the prosecutor's office.
Yes.
The record was supplied completely by the prosecutor's office.
Yes.
Okay. You did not seek out any additional information.
So far as I know, I got all the information.
Okay. And does that include then the entirety of discovery, over 50,000 pages of discovery?
I don't know how many pages there were, but I have several notebooks filled with what I got. So if there's something specific that I'm not aware of, please inform me.
Were you given any discs of recorded interviews other
Yes.
than Mr. Sigg?
I don't know if they were recorded or transcripts. I read interviews, but I don't remember which of them were recorded and which were transcripts.
Okay. Now again, this is content and information provided to you by the prosecutors, and they also sought to retain you at the inception of this case.
Yes,
They retained you back in October of 2012.
yes.
And your report was not provided to the defense until, I don't know if you know this, just about 10 days ago.
No, I don't know exactly when it was provided to the defense.
Okay. And you're being paid for your time in court?
Yes,
You're paid for your review of the record provided by the prosecution?
yes.
And what does that amount?
$2.50 an hour.
Okay, and how much have you billed so far?
I have no idea.
Have you submitted bills to the prosecutor's office?
I have submitted bills.
Okay. And on how many occasions? Is it quarterly?
I think I billed twice.
Okay. And you have absolutely no idea how much you...
I don't remember.
How many hours have you put into the work you've done?
I can't tell you. The billing records are available. I'm sure we could get them, but they all include all of the hours in this case, but I don't remember how many hours it was.
Okay, so no personal interviews of anyone associated with Austin Sigg. And just so we're clear, without ever meeting Austin Sigg, performing testing,
Ask and answer.
I would like to finish my question.
Go ahead.
Perform.
You may ask your question.
Without ever meeting or performing any testing on Austin Sigg, you are diagnosing him and labeling him today under oath in court.
Yes, I am saying that the records suggest that he is sadistic based on his pornography and his crime. Yes.
Those are labels, those are diagnoses. And in Wisconsin, are you able as a psychologist, as a PhD, to put labels on individuals without ever meeting them or performing any testing?
I'm sorry, the compound nature of the question, form of the question.
It is compound. I think she understands it. You understand the question?
Yes, in civil commitment work, we are often, offenders don't have to agree to an interview in Wisconsin, and we are often working without the benefit of an interview. In Iowa, the 60 cases that I did, for Iowa alone, you are not allowed an interview until after probable cause. So in forensic work and civil commitment work, it does happen at times that you make diagnoses based on records.
And that is something as a psychologist that you do reluctantly, I would imagine.
Well, there are certain situations where you don't want to do it, and those are typically custody and divorce cases because the quality of the information is poor because you're getting information mostly from an adversarial party. So I'm not saying that in every case you can make a diagnosis based on records, but it is true that it is common in the forensic world where you have adequate records of a crime and also transcripts of interviews with a variety of people associated with a person that you are able to make a diagnosis.
But not in every case.
Not in every case.
And in this situation, you were not the one conducting the interviews.
No, I was not.
Law enforcement was conducting the interviews.
That's correct.
Law enforcement who do not have a medical background.
Not to my knowledge.
Law enforcement that are not licensed psychologists or psychiatrists.
That's correct.
Law enforcement whose motives may be very different than the motives of a psychologist or psychiatrist?
They may be, but they coincide in a case like this where you're trying to understand what happened. Law enforcement is trying to understand what he did and why he did it, and that is what a psychologist in this case would be trying to understand.
And did you talk personally with those detectives?
No.
You talked about some of your assessment of Austin's motivations.
Yes.
You talked about your assessment, your opinion, that his motivation here in terms of the crime involving Jessica Ridgeway, at least in part, was, well, in your opinion, must have been sexual. He watched and masturbated, you said, to snuff films, and he watched and masturbated to child pornography. That's
Yes.
your testimony. Okay. Now, there is no, so, I mean, certainly there is nowhere in the record where anyone in terms of brother, in terms of friends, tell law enforcement, yes, I saw him watching this material, and yes, I saw him masturbating.
No, the material was found on his computers, and he himself said that he masturbated to the material.
There is no video capturing that information or that situation.
I'm sorry, do you mean, did he take a video of himself masturbating to porn?
Right.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. You're relying in large part on his statements.
Yes.
His
Right.
statements to law enforcement.
Yes, his statements and the computer analysis showed that he had visited sites like such as the ones I described.
Okay. In terms of the computer forensics, you did not, again, personally interview any of the computer forensic experts?
No, I relied on their reports.
Okay, and in their reports, what we know is that the last time any content involving child pornography was viewed was back in June of 2012.
Well, my understanding is that they found pornography related in that time frame, but they also found evidence that he had covered his tracks and that not all was accessible.
But in terms of what you have direct knowledge
Yeah.
of, back June of 2012, there's no direct evidence that he viewed child pornography prior to leaving his home on the morning of October 5th?
No, I don't know whether or not he did that. He didn't say he did, and there was no record of it.
No evidence that that occurred the night before?
No, I don't know that. I don't know after June how often he viewed child pornography. He did admit to viewing it, but I don't know how often he viewed it.
Okay. So really, what your sort of focus comes down to and what you testified to on direct was his admission was significant to you.
His admission was significant to me.
But then on the other hand, you've also testified to how we can't believe most of what Mr. Sigg said during the course of the interview with law enforcement.
What you have to do is look at the interviews with the understanding that some things are likely true, but all things may not be true. So you look at what they say, and you look at that in the light of the evidence. We have evidence that he had a long-standing interest in child pornography that went at least from 2008 to 2012, so I didn't question his statements that he viewed child pornography. On the other hand, there were things that he didn't talk about or he left out or contradicted the evidence, and that's not unusual in these cases. Usually it is not the case that they lie about everything or tell the truth about everything.
And we'll get to that, the tip of the iceberg comment.
If the witness was done answering the question, did you complete your answer, ma'am?
Yeah, yes, that's fine.
Thank you. want to go to your report.
Okay?
You did indicate that Austin is not and was not generally antisocial.
Yes, I believe that.
No history of criminal activity
That's-
other than this
Sorry.
event.
Yes, that's correct.
And his attitudes towards authority were conventional.
Yes.
Now, you indicated that it's important, particularly in light of not interviewing the individual that you're opining on, to look at background information.
Yes.
And that includes and goes back even to pregnancy of the mother.
You can.
Okay. And in your report, you talked about the pregnancy being uneventful, his childhood being fairly uneventful, with the exception of his, parents' divorce.
Yes.
Okay. And in this case, you were actually not only charged with or hired to render opinions for the prosecution, but also to look at mitigation in the case.
Yes.
That was also, you indicated, part of your assessment, part of your evaluation.
Yes.
And in terms of mitigation, what mitigation means, just to make sure you and I are on the same page of what mitigation means, mitigation is, well, what's your assessment of what mitigation is?
Factors that would reduce the culpability.
Okay. So in terms of going back to the beginning, an uneventful pregnancy, were you aware that Austin's mother inhaled paint fumes in her last trimester,
No, I wasn't.
just 2 months before Austin was born?
No.
Were you aware that she suffered a hard fall and fell down 3 steps of stairs, concrete stairs, just about 6 months prior to Austin's birth?
No, I don't remember. I don't remember reading that.
Were you aware that vacuum extraction was necessary during the delivery in order to get Mr. Austin from the birth canal?
No.
That he, in fact, was born with at least an initial head deformity due to the use of the vacuum?
No.
Were you aware that he was born with a deformity in his intestine?
No, I don't remember any records on that.
And that by 2 months, Austin was back in the Children's Hospital for 5 days for surgery
No.
at 2 months old? Now, are you aware that did the prosecution provide you with any medical history related to Mr. Sigg's time in Children's Hospital?
The records I had said that the pregnancy was uneventful, so I'm not aware of adverse events during the pregnancy.
And not focused on the pregnancy records, but focused on records from Children's Hospital about that first hospitalization that I mentioned. Did you receive any records from the prosecution from Children's Hospital?
I don't remember seeing any records.
You don't remember seeing any records at all?
I don't remember seeing records from Children's.
Okay. Did you see education records?
Did see some education records.
Employment records?
I believe so, but I don't remember details of his employment.
And then any additional medical records?
Yes, I did review records. I can't give you the details of which medical records.
Okay, and again, these would be the records that the prosecution decided to send to you?
Yes.
Okay. And again, I'm just focusing on the Children's Hospital records, employment records, and education records. Were you aware that Austin was back in the hospital by 6 months for a follow-up operation?
I don't remember any records from the hospital in his first year of life.
And then there would be another ER visit before he was 1 year old.
Okay.
Austin was then back in Children's Hospital for a major surgery at 3 years old, and that was at Children's Hospital.
Okay.
And again at 6 years old.
Okay.
He spoke a little bit about his religious therapy, or the therapy in 2008, and then you indicated that his mother was able to find treatment for her son.
Yes.
Okay. And you're basing that on the records that you were provided by the district attorney?
Well, all the records were sent to me by the district attorney.
Okay. And in your report, you wrote that Mindy Sigg, Austin's biological mother, found pornography on his computer. She took him to a Christian counselor.
Yes.
He went for a few months at the most, and then after 2 to 3 times, Austin dropped out.
Yes.
And that's your understanding based on your review of the records that were provided to you.
Yes.
Now, in fact, Austin Sigg was brought to treatment by his stepmother, Susie Stevens. That treatment began April 1st of 2008. Did you know that?
No, I thought Mindy Sigg brought him to, found pornography on his computer and took him to the counselor.
So you didn't know that it was actually his stepmother
No.
who initiated that? His stepmother who signed all the documentation and the initial paperwork with Harl Hargett?
No.
The admission date for the treatment was April 1st of 2008.
Okay.
And Austin went through both individual and group therapy, and he was discharged from treatment in early 2009.
Okay.
You indicated that it was problematic to you that he'd even been to treatment because then Austin would know that treatment was available to him, and that he knew that through his mom he could seek help and not, right?
Yes.
Now, we know that Mom didn't actually initiate the treatment. Susie Stevens did.
We don't know that. These are facts, not evidence. Asking it that way doesn't change that.
Well, I'll have her hear the question, and she may answer if she understands. But can you repeat your question, please?
We know, or you're indicating that you didn't know, based on the record that was provided to you, that it was actually Susie Stevens that brought him to treatment and not his mom.
I'm confused. Are you saying that his mother didn't find the pornography on the computer?
I'm talking about treatment.
Oh, I see. So it's correct that his mother found the pornography and his stepmother took him into treatment. Or is that the question I'm being asked?
No, it's not, and I understand why you're adding to that, but let's just listen to the question.
Okay.
I think the question was, forget about who found it or when they found it. That's not the question. The stepmother was the one that apparently signed the admission to treatment.
Okay.
You said you didn't know that.
No, I didn't know that.
Next question.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I'm also going to assume that you did not know, based on your testimony earlier, and what you just, let me back up. I'm going to assume that you did not know, based on your comments about the treatment being available, and that being concerning to you because he wouldn't get in trouble, that during one of these sessions, what was conveyed to the doctor is that the biological father and stepmother are concerned about this use. However, from the stepmother's perspective, they're not likely to do much but scream and shame him. The biological mother cannot take off work to get him to counseling, assuming that wasn't part of the record.
I don't remember if I read that or not.
In that in early February of 2009, Dr. Harl Hargett actually had to send a letter to Austin's father on February 18th, 2009, at the bequest of Austin, asking him for help, because Austin is currently afflicted with a certain level of an anxiety disorder, which is very difficult to self-manage. Usually this kind of disruption can be medicated in very compulsive manners, including the use and abuse of pornography, and they were seeking help from the dad for parental controls on computers and televisions because up to that point there had not been, at least according to the record, much help from dad in this regard.
I'm sorry.
Are you testifying to all these facts and then asking her if she knew?
Yes.
Did you know any of that?
Yes, I knew he was given medication, and that they believed the medication would help with the pornography use.
You indicated that you were charged with looking at mitigation. Towards the end of your report, you comment that the behavior in this case cannot be explained by, and you indicate socioeconomic deprivation,
Right.
upbringing, childhood abuse, bullying. That's on page 16.
Yes.
So you are specifically looking for potential evidence of bullying, not as an explanation in its entirety, but just as this maybe mitigation.
Yes.
Were you aware that Austin's former high school classmate, Sarah Moravec, M-O-R-A-V-E-C, was interviewed by police?
Yes.
You're aware of that?
I read all the interviews by police. I don't remember what particularly she said, but I read all the interviews.
Okay, well, what she told law enforcement was that she would pick on Sigg in the school commons or in front of the school. She said she would call Sigg a faggot a lot and told him he was saying he had a girlfriend to cover up he was gay. Sarah said Sigg wouldn't respond and just walked away. Sigg was picked on a lot by everyone, to include Rachel and Megan.
My memory is that Sigg in the interview said he wasn't bullied.
So a teenager who was being interviewed by law enforcement asked if he was bullied, denied being bullied.
Yes, he denied being bullied.
And that was one statement you found credible.
Yes, to say he was bullied could be used as an excuse for his behavior, so it certainly wasn't in his best interest to say that he was not bullied. And you do evaluate statements in terms of whether they are used as excuses or they are against interest.
So you were provided with that report but did not include that information in that part of the report.
No, I still believe that bullying did not cause Austin Sigg to abduct, rape, and murder this child. I don't believe that bullying was what was behind this.
You were also charged with finding mitigation, and you just indicated that was part of your mitigation analysis. But I will move on. I'm going to move on to school performance.
Is there a question? Is that with Collins?
She said she was moving on. Next question.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, I think this would be a good time for a break.
Thank you. I've got about one councilman approach. This is just for timing and. Break, mid-morning break.
Thank you.
Then I anticipate once we come back, we will finish with this witness and not break for noon until we finish with this witness. Let's take at least 15 minutes. Everyone please remain seated. Thank you. Until Mr. Sigg is escorted. Thank you. We'll be back at 11:31. Let's see, 11:41, 11:46, we'll be back in 15 minutes. Okay? Be recessed.